Hi everybody, my name is David Keplinger. I'm a professor in the Department of Literature and I direct AU's MFA program in creative writing. And 2 years ago, I was approached by the museum director, Jack Rasmussen, to curate a show that sought a place of conversation in the interstice between language and visual art, and whose themes wanted to press into the space between borders, a frontier of political and aesthetic ambiguity. When I heard it involved my friend Ethelbert Miller, and when I saw the work of Kebedech Tekleab, whom you'll hear about in a moment, I knew that I wanted to be a part of this show. In my career, collaboration has played an important role. I've translated several books with Danish and German writers, and that's my class on translation there in the video. I've also collaborated musically. From my great-great-grandfather's Civil War era poems, I wrote and produced an album called By and By, which was released in 2012. So collaboration is a big part of my life. And as a poet, I'm interested in collage. That is in creating a space on the page where the part takes on meaning by its relationship to the other parts. I believe with Mallarmé that things don't have inherent meaning, but in the interstice between, in their association with the other, when they're set side by side. And that's what we have here in this show, Blue and Gray, this Era of Exile. An American poet and an Ethiopian artist seek a space together in which the notion of exile can be explored and revealed in ways neither part could accomplish alone. Kebedech Tekleab is a poet, painter, and sculptor born of Eritrean parents, and she had to flee Ethiopia in 1979 after participating in a student protest against the Derg. She walked through the Ogaden Desert, where she was captured by Somali soldiers and detained in a concentration camp there for 10 years. What followed was migration to the United States, eventual study at Howard University, a Master's of Fine Arts in 1995, and an academic position in New York, where she now lives and teaches as a tenured associate professor of studio art at the City University of New York, Queensborough. Her recent work has been shown around the world, significantly in Greece, as well as in essential exhibits at institutions such as the Museum of African Art, the Smithsonian, and the Holocaust Museum in Illinois, which acquired her work, The River in Rwanda. Ethelbert Miller was born in the Bronx. His father emigrated from Panama to the United States. He's a literary activist and author of 2 memoirs and several poetry collections. As many of you in this room know, he hosts the WPFW morning radio show On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller, and hosts and produces The Scholars on UDC TV, which received a 2020 Telly Award. He's associate editor and columnist for the American Book Review, and was given a 2020 Congressional Award from Congressman Jamie Raskin in recognition of his literary activism. Yeah, let's hear that. He was awarded the 2022 Howard Zinn Lifetime Achievement Award by the Peace and Justice Studies Association, and named a 2023 Grammy nominee finalist. My album didn't make this list. I don't know what happened. But Grammy nominee finalist for the Best Spoken Word Poetry album. And his latest book is How I Found Love Behind the Catcher's Mask. And in 2023, I want to add, he collaborated with Miho Kinas to produce the elegant little book, which I just love, We Eclipse into the Other Side. So we're going to have a conversation here about some of the themes of the show, and then what we wanted to do was open up the questions to the audience so that there could be more interaction and engagement with the people who have actually come to see the show and to see it in person all around us. So I'll just start out with a couple of questions and we'll get the conversation rolling, and then we'll turn it over to you all. So if you look around the room, you'll see that Kebedech's work suggests the appearance of solidity. There's a solidity that comes across when we're looking at her art, especially the sculpture. And yet, if you look at it closely, it's made of acrylic and mesh. So this appearance of solidity, and then when looked at closely, the kind of disappearance of that solidness, of that hardness, seems to be a major theme in your work. And it might be related to the so-called solidity of borders, or the so-called solidity or realness of a life vest that's actually fake and provided just for show. So I wonder if you could talk about that. Was that a conscious effort on your part, or is it something that just naturally kind of arises when you make your work?
Good afternoon, everybody. Could you hear me?
No.
Hello? Hello?
Oh, it takes a second. It takes a second, yeah. Now it's on.
All right. I'm still trying to recover from my rash, so bear with me. The question is very interesting because...
Talk into the mic.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Good. So the question actually addresses my journey overall. I started as a realist in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, when I was a student of Fine Arts School of Addis Ababa. And that realism served a purpose when I joined Howard University as an undergraduate student. I worked in the tradition of expressionism and impressionism mostly for a long time. Then I changed. On the video you might have heard my story in terms of why I changed, which is because of the subject matter that I was dealing with, which took me actually inward instead of visualizing something from the outside. So in early 20s, I moved towards exploring this new medium, mesh. At that time, it was a time that I lost my mentor, Professor Skender, and we have worked together for a long time. In the beginning as a student, then it moved towards being, a collaboration between him and me, and we did this huge, beautiful sculpture, outdoor sculpture for the Ethiopian embassy here in Washington, D.C. So losing him was really tremendously impactful in my, on my feelings. So what does that mean to be working with him for a long time and then losing him? And time was the primary thing that came to mind, and how do you express that time for a complex man, like Skender Bogassian, and how do you talk about his life through a medium that I was going to explore. So I explored so many different materials, and finally I settled with mesh because of its transparency and translucency. Then I had to investigate, how to handle the mesh, which is porous. And the big question was, how do you put acrylic, which is liquid, on a porous material? So it took me years to explore, and I wanted also to deal with the durability of the work itself, which I exposed my material, leaving it in the balcony for exposing it for all kinds of, weather for a long time. Then, eventually, The first piece that I did was, of course, about Skender Bogassian, which is almost the size of this piece that you see. And the title was Flow of Time. Then I came back to my original theme, or quote-unquote original, because since my graduate studies, the humanity that I see around me and explore became, my main purpose, to make art. It doesn't mean that I don't explore other things, as an artist. I love music, I love dance, performances, literature, etc. But I refocused again on the global situation of specifically the refugee, project. So that started mainly as a main focus on 27.
Thank you, Kevin. Ethelbert, do you have something to say about solidity and transparency as it relates to your poems or how they are in conversation with these works?
Well, I think that we're here because we collaborated before. I think that I've seen her grow and develop as an artist. I know when she had her studio over in Northern Virginia. I also remember she had an interest in terms of doing research dealing with refugees in Africa. So she was doing scholarly work, that I found very interesting and attractive. For me, I would mention that reading the book Travelers by Helen Kabila, who was a professor at George Mason University, really opened my eyes in terms of issues of refugees in Europe, in his novel there in Germany. I would also connect that to something that I did 2 years ago, where I was part of a delegation that went down to the border here in our country and looked at migrants coming across into the United States. It also made me aware of the difference between migrants and refugees, in terms of people who become migrants because of looking for work, better opportunities, and then there are people, refugees, who are fleeing wars and gangs. And so sometimes what happens, those two groups get confused, okay? Or when we look at the border, we think that everyone coming across the border into the United States is from Mexico, when many times they're from Africa and Cuba and so many other countries. And one of the things I feel is a responsibility is that art opens up a conversation, around this. It is impossible to sit here and talk about what's on the wall without looking at the recent tragedies off the coast of Greece. This isn't an issue that is years ago. This is what's going on right now, and we have a responsibility, if nothing else, to at least be aware of it. Okay, to at least have a sense of compassion for our fellow human beings. One of the things that I looked at in this exhibit, that when you do look at that little, life jacket, it's for a child. Okay, if you look at the situation off the coast of Greece, on the lower level of that boat were children. Okay? And I recently read, I think I have it here, I recently read an excerpt of a poem by Warsan Shiri. She's a Kenyan poet from Somali descent who's in London right now. And the beginning of her poem reads as follows: "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well." And then there's a second part of the poem which you read. You have to understand no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land.
Right.
And that's something just for us to think about. And the other thing I would end on this, we talk about collaboration, but we should also talk about convergence. I think that if you walk from this exhibit into the next one, Lost Europe, and you look at the situation dealing with Ukraine, you go from color to black and white, and then you go from black and white back to color, you see that these two exhibits complement each other. Okay? So don't leave here. Like they said, politics and prose. Please put your seats up. Before you do that, make sure you take in the exhibit next door, and then walk back to this one, because there's a dialogue that takes place.
Yeah, absolutely. The collaboration that's happening in this museum is not just between these two individuals here, but also between what's happening in the next room and the next. It was beautifully organized that way. And it's interesting, in the Washington Post, I think it's today, one of the survivors of that capsizing said that there was absolutely no choice but to get on that boat, and I think he was seeking cancer treatment for his son. So there's a lot to say about leaving in talking about this show, but there's also a lot to say about coming home to something as well. And I just want to read what each of you wrote about the show as you were putting it together. Ethelbert, you said that the artist seeks home in the work of another. You say, when we collaborate, I find a grayness lifting from my life. Collaboration between artists is one of the first stages or levels of building community. It relies on trust. The artist seeks home in the work of another. And then Kebedech, you say, I step out of my zone to greet E. Ethelbert Miller's poems and bring them home. So do you think that all artists are artists, poets, musicians, visual artists, sculptors, are they artists because they are seeking a way to find home? Is there a point of exile that makes us artists? What do you think about that?
I would say yes, but for me, that's how it worked, specifically with this collaborative project. Could you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
It's on,
Okay.
just hold it a bit closer.
All right. So with the collaborative project, Ethelbert started responding to the blue piece right here, and wrote a poem, which is, if not specifically about that piece, but something that was inspired by that piece. And I had to take it into consideration and move on with that poetry of Ethelbert, which was the Blue Years.
Mm-hmm.
And the Blue Years was in some ways challenging. I already talked about it. I don't want to bore you over here. How the language, the Amharic language, couldn't accommodate for me the essence of, blueness. However, what I was not able to do visually was going to be covered by something which is from the literary world. So that combination was very exciting, to me. In addition to that, there was also a translation aspect of it that really put us together in close communication, and something that I missed, or I thought that I missed in the translation, or in the meaning of, or in the essence of poetry that Ethelbert, wrote. I needed to reach out and have a discussion with him. So that is both inspiration and also growth, which really, continued throughout the last, 2 years almost? Yes.
I think we read the poem.
Let's do it.
Okay. This is, I'll read the English and you can read the translation. It's on page 50. The Blue Years. And then we walked out into the rain, as if we were walking to the sea. So many weeping because of dangerous memories. Life is a flood of tears. We were born somewhere between heartbreak and desire. The place we fled before the cry. The Blue Years, when we had no food or water. The blue years, when many were strangled by the air. So much thirst, too much blueness on our tongues.
ሰማያዊ ህብረ ዓመታት እናም ወደ ውጭ ወጣን ዝናብ እንደ ዶፍ እየጣለ ህሊናችን ወደ ሀሪት በሐዘን እየቆሰለ ያቋረጥነውን ባህር እንደገና እየቀዘፍነው አእምሯችንን በስቃይ ፊታችንን በንባጠብነው ህይወት የብካይ ጎርፍ ነው እኛም የተወለድነው በብሩህ ፍላጎትና በተስፋ መቁረጥ መሃል ነው በዚያ ቦታ ከዋይታችን ቀደም ብሎ በስደት ወደ ረገጥ ነው ሰማያዊ ህብረ ዓመታት የሚቀመስ ምግብና የውሃ ጠል የታጡበት ሰማያዊ ህብረ ዓመታት ቁጥራቸው የበዛ ሰዎች በአየር ንፍገት የሞቱበት ይህ ነው የማይባል ጥማት ምላሶቻችን የታበሱት በሰማያዊ ቀለማት
We have to also wonder about the blue notes that we just heard and how the call went unanswered. You know, that's a situation many times. People who are seeking asylum, filling out forms and stuff, many times calls go unanswered. And it's sort of symbolic that the phone was ringing. We didn't pick it up, we turned it off. But we heard it.
In our conversation over here in my translation class, what came up were the problems of translation between these projects and these poems. One of them was the topic of blueness. So, and since it's in the title of the show, it might be worth talking about for 5 minutes before we go to questions from the audience. But the problem of blueness.
Well, you know, it's just like revision when you're writing poems, and I'm sure Kyle Dargan's here, Mars Caru's here, Gene Nordhoff. There's a lot of poets in this audience. And many times you write, and then you go back and look at things. And I went back and looked and I said, blue and gray. I wasn't thinking about the fact that, you know, where we are right here in terms of geographical location. In fact, when you think about the tourist attraction, what brings people to this area is the Civil War. When you look at the Civil War, it's pretty much, the battles are around here. You know, Lincoln assassinated here. You know, but a lot of Pennsylvania, you know, Virginia, that's the Civil War. And I wasn't looking at blue and gray in terms of Civil War, even though when we look at issues of refugees, many times it's because of civil wars. You know, so it sort of complements it. But for me, it was like, well, I wasn't thinking about that. But then coming back and looking at it, I said, well, wow, this has another meaning that I wasn't even aware of. And this is why sometimes with collaboration, and then also especially with poetry, there's always a surprise element. You know, there's always something that you say, wow, I must be a genius. You know? But there's that surprise element that if they don't have that, after a while, your art does not interest you. You lose that sense of joy, that sense of surprise. And that's why sometimes at a particular point in your life, it is important to collaborate, because that brings back that joy. You sort of get a sense of renewal. And so I'm deeply grateful, you know, to have the opportunity to interact with you, because that's how I grow and that's how I learn. But there's always that surprise element to say, wow, you know, I'm looking at this title of the show differently. The same way I interviewed you a couple of years ago. And that was my introduction in terms of preparing to ask her questions about her work so that I could get a deeper insight, especially because her work is abstract. I wanted to see what she sees, and then I wanted to see what I would see my second viewing. Okay? I interact, okay? But I want to make sure. And this is why what happens is that for abstract art, just like jazz especially like Albert Ayler or Nick Coleman, it challenges you. It challenges your ear. In this case, it's your eye is challenged. And how you deal with that is very important. And the key thing I always say, and I always say in your class, about collaboration, it's a key thing that what happens to the artist after they collaborate. How are they transformed? Okay? We are different people because of this show. Okay? 2 years in the making. Okay? And what we do next, whether it's another collaboration or just our own individual work, will have changed. And that's the joy of being an artist.
Okay, the blue and the gray, well, the blueness means something different in comparing. And what about the grayness that we see in your work here, this conversation between?
The grayness actually refers to the way migrants, leave their location. So there are primarily two ways of, leaving one's home. It's either by water or land. So both are dangerous, and refugees are exposed to the dangers of, passing through that foreign land without any protection and with unknown destination. So considering, the way migrants flew, their countries, actually created the essence of that coloration in me. So blue and gray, both are metaphorically used in here. And talking about the gray equivalent of, Amharic essences, we do have that expression, which is gracha. So it wasn't challenging on that regard.
Yes.
Yes.
May I open it to you all? Does anyone here have a question they'd like to ask? Yes.
In terms of collaboration, has the opportunity arisen for Kebedech to be inspired by a poem of yours, Ethelbert's, and to create a work of art?
Yes. Inspiration is sometimes very subtle. You don't even pinpoint, where you were inspired, but directly the piece that you're going to find on the other room, the blue piece, is a direct inspiration of his poem. Yes.
And I would say it's very important that we look at you as a poet. Everyone's talking about your artwork, but I know you always remind me, Ethelbert, I'm a poet too, of note. And I think that's very important too, because, you bring that sensibility even before you translated my work. You are a poet.
I write in Amharic mainly, but from time to time, depending on what inspires a certain poem, it comes out in English. And it feels like me, I guess. It comes with its own slant or with its own, accent. So I embrace that. But mainly, I write in Amharic.
This is also for you. There are a lot of moving parts in your work, particularly the sculptures. There are a lot of moving parts, particularly in the sculptures. And I can understand that mesh is malleable, but not infinitely malleable. And I wonder how you go about harmonizing, that's not the right word, combining the different elements of this. Like, do you sometimes find I have the right shape but the wrong color? Or I would just enjoy hearing a little bit more about your artistic process, creative process.
Great question. It is founded on the essence of improvisation. And the fact that I'm not literal about things gives me also to feel in the gray areas. In some ways, it's just like writing a poem. And you don't want to be didactic, but you have a certain feeling that engages you in a certain way. So this also, the mesh, the exploration of finding the right form, as you mentioned, and the right color, depends on the improvisation. Of course, this boils down to what you had known before about art. from time to time I tell my students about what improvisation is, and the best example that I could give is, even though I'm not a musician, jazz comes to mind. So how do jazz musicians, jam instantly? Are they just bluffing, or do they know the foundation of what music is, and they digress from a certain melody and they come back to it, etc. So that my approach is that it is through exploration. For instance, the piece that you find on the wall, way out there, the paper fold. I did that in this room.
Here?
Yes, here, instantly. So what was the guiding force? It is accumulated knowledge that I have about form, about color, about space. That's going to help me, put the things together. So I think it's a cumulative thing.
It's a wonderful piece too. It's the one that is over by the window, hanging on the wall, beyond the gate there. And it's kind of an overture for the whole show, because it does have pieces of everything that you're about to see here.
Yes.
You went from socialist realism to this, and I think of the poet named Paul Celan, who began as a very strictly formal poet in the 1930s, grew up in what's now Romania, and then after having gone to a forced labor camp and his parents going to Auschwitz, he became a language poet. It's like language had to dissolve, break apart, and reform again in order to translate the reality that he knew now was his life. And I wonder, does your story, Somalia, all of the things that happened from early years as an artist to now, have something to do with trying to translate in the same way?
That's true. And talking about Salan, his work inspired so many visual artists, including Kiefer. So Anselm Kiefer was inspired by him, and for what purpose? So the things that you mentioned is going to be, relevant to his own transformation, and maybe it was true to Kiefer's transformation as well.
Right.
Yes. So the experience that I had, in Ethiopia and in Somalia was vital in terms of my thinking and growth. So most of you had, heard about my stories, that I was imprisoned in the concentration camp for 10 years, etc. So you can imagine all kinds of, terrible situations, which is true. But there is also some interesting things, happening that changed my life positively. And one of the things is also, of course, finding people that are completely selfless, and to the opposite of brutality that you might experience. And we had an underground school that the prisoners themselves, established, and by the time we were released, there was nobody who could not write and read, at least. And we also had a formal class up to grade 12. So one person teaching, another prisoner, etc. And during that process, from time to time, reading and writing is completely, illegal. But from time to time, we would find smuggled books. And I remember reading, this is really surprising, Alex Harris' book, Roots and Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi. And what kind of parallel was it for me? I mean, witnessing a life similar, to that, with a different level of, intensity. However, with lots of parallels between those places, in spite of, the time difference and the geographic location difference that we had. So that, continued to inspire me and saved me in a way. I'm not saying this, the other ways was not, a good way. So, but it helped me to focus more on the global instead of just simply what had happened to me and to my immediate surrounding. So it is a continuous thing.
Fantastic answer, thank you.
And I think there's also a larger question. I think we were talking about this before. When you look at Africa and you look at Cold War politics, and I remember, for example, like in the 70s, you were pulled either to the west or to the east. So I remember being in the Soviet Union at the time and visiting Lumumba University, which was training like African leadership. The same way Howard University was probably training Ethiopian leaders during when Haile Selassie, there was a lot of people from Ethiopia coming to Howard. And you get into the Cold War, so you look up, if you are being influenced by the culture coming from Russia at that time, that's where the social realism comes in. Okay? If you're going to England or you're going to the United States, I think it's a different influence. And I think this is how we have to look at colonization, global politics, and how that influences the trends in culture and art. Okay? That we create a certain way because of our education. Okay? This is why you get somebody like a Ngugi out of Kenya who says, okay, after a while, I want to write Kikuyu, because I'm a well-known writer, but many people can't read my books. Okay? And if, for example, you're an artist, okay, what images are you giving the people? Okay? And you might recall in Ethiopia as well as in Cuba, there was a point where, we were looking like this, to get us to work, the harvest or whatever. But that was a look. And that was a way that we were very much realizing that there was an ideology that was emphasizing class. Okay, that we wanted to be workers and we wanted to harvest, and it was this nationalism. And the artists, many times, were supported by the state. Okay? And if you left the country, maybe you created differently because you were now in exile. Okay? And you're much more freer to create. The state is not telling you what to do. I can imagine Mary Gravitt telling me what pounds to write. Just a joke.
Well, that's interesting because it relates to Ornette Coleman. It relates to the way that bebop kind of broke music apart and put it back together.
Sure, you take Ornette Coleman, you get that special free jazz album where people just walk in and they say, okay, we don't come in here. We're going to create something new. We're going to follow each other. We're going to listen.
Because you're on the outside,
right,
because you're exiled. Yeah. Shall we go back to the audience? Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying about translation.
Hey, we have a microphone coming.
Nice, okay.
Hi,
Hello? No. No?
Hello.
It takes a second.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on what you said about translating. I mean, I'm not a translator, but through all my years here, I always end up people asking me to translate and to interpret, and I do it just for fun, just for helping things, or writing a document in one language and then translating into the other. But I found that translating, literature in general, but poetry is the most difficult thing I have ever tried to do. And I only was trying to do it for my grandson. So it was a very simple poem. So you mentioned a little bit about the challenges. Could you elaborate a little more on that? Because it's quite amazing to translate poetry. Thank you.
I come on that because I have a book that's on hold because we can't deal with translation. I've written a book of haiku that we've been trying to translate into Hebrew, but we can't get the person to do the proof to make sure the Hebrew is correct, especially because it's poetry and it's haiku. Okay, so what happens is that we gave it to one person who really didn't understand poetry, but they knew Hebrew, and they said, well, there's something wrong here. and they were so harsh that I couldn't even tell my friend Robbie, who's doing the translation, like, well, they think that your translations are horrible. But the person was looking at it as a teacher, like, okay, they're looking at it, they're not giving him the leeway if this is a poem, and this is a haiku, that maybe it's not supposed to be exact. But it was a whole thing where the book is still on hold because we can't find the right person who knows the Hebrew and likes poetry.
Yes, it's a very difficult process, and I really appreciate Ethelbert's attitude towards it because he doesn't read or understand or the language Amharic that I was using. And it was a total trust, between the two of us, believing in me that I'm going to do, a good job. But I was I appreciated it a lot, but I also felt so responsible. I have to make him know, in some way, that this translation is quote unquote good. So there was no way for me to do that. Somehow maybe it could be, maybe you can talk about it yourself. I don't know how he trusted me, he did. Until Chris Bucket, the poet, the British poet who wrote the first Ethiopian anthology, wrote an article in here. But that is after we have done the work and after, graciously, Ethelbert took my translation, into account. Yes. But the language itself, the elasticity of the language is not, something which was compatible, to me. So to accommodate, the essence of Ethelbert's poem, sometimes I had to coin or reuse the existing words slightly differently or so. And one other challenge that I ran into was Ethiopian poetry, whether it is the contemporary poetry or the older poetry form, they rhyme. And contemporary poetry in English tradition do not. Yeah, so how do you make that voice meaningful to Ethiopians without losing the taste, but without forcing it to rhyme? So that was one challenge that I had.
I'd just like to say congratulations, it's a beautiful show. I've been following your work since the 70s, and I've always loved it. But I find, even in spite of the dire subject of exile, they're so beautiful. Each one is so beautiful. Whereas I know your early works, and I loved them, they were so powerfully full of grief. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes. Yeah, so earlier, David, you asked me, you mentioned, realism and specifically socialist realism and how I grew, out of it. And the literalness of, making art, trying to make a narrative through my imagery, coloration, etc., was fading away, gradually. So my professors back home, the Ethiopian arts, were excellent in realism. And there is no mistake in terms of reading what they tried to do, with the artwork. So because of that globalness that I felt, early on, after reading, those books, etc., understanding, the situation, then I moved toward semi-abstract works and maybe that's the works that you know, the earlier ones, and they have more, readable elements in them. So there is some rawness, to the artworks that I did then. But eventually I moved towards non-objective, works. And as most of you know, the modernism or the modern era of art making tried to mimic what music did or does. So how do you understand music without lyrics? It is, but still you continue to be moved by the way it is composed, by the elements, coloration, etc. So I tried to create that kind of parallel, to be able to speak in a language that's going to be more applicable and open-ended. So I wanted that open-endedness. How do you translate, those pieces in your own way without, being forced to read it in a certain way? So that's what I'm trying to do.